I never told anyone, not my children, not my sister, not even the priest who buried my husband. But I suppose when you're nearing the end of your own story, you begin to understand that some truths don't want to stay buried. They live in your chest like an unfinished letter, and one day when the house is quiet and the photos are all facing you, they start whispering to be told. So I'll say it here now, with no drama and no apology. I loved someone who was not my husband, and I loved him while my husband was still alive. I know how that sounds. I know the names you might be whispering, but I want you to listen, not just with your ears, but with the part of you that knows how grief can sneak into love, and how love sometimes arrives dressed in the clothes of kindness, when kindness is the only thing you've hungered for in years. My name is Margaret. I'm 71 years old, and I've lived a quiet life. I was married to Arthur for 48 years. We met when I was 17. I was wearing a lilac dress, and he was the boy at church who sat 3 pews ahead and never smiled at anything. He smiled at me, though. Once. That was enough. We married the following spring. I wore my mother's veil and shoes half a size too small. He worked construction. I taught piano from home once the children came. We made it work, the way most people do, by folding small dreams into big sacrifices. He was a good man, a stern one. He never beat me, never ran around, never raised his voice, but he also wasn't soft. Not in the way I sometimes needed. That's not a crime. We did our best. Years passed. The children grew, moved away. The house grew quiet. Then the illness came. I suppose the signs were there earlier than I admitted. He started repeating things, forgetting his keys. Once he called me by his sister's name and didn't seem to notice. The doctor said it was vascular dementia, with Parkinson's creeping behind it like a second shadow. I remember sitting in that beige office, holding a tissue I hadn't cried into yet and thinking, I will never be looked at the same way again. That was 6 years ago. 6 years of watching the man I married disappear inch by inch. First his words, then his steps, then his recognition of me. I bathed him, fed him, wiped the corners of his mouth, and kissed the forehead of a man who no longer remembered I was his wife. I slept beside him as he twitched through dreams I wasn't part of. I said goodnight and got no reply, and I never once thought of leaving. Not once. But love didn't leave me. It just came back in a form I didn't expect. His name was Daniel. The agency sent him when I finally admitted I couldn't lift Arthur anymore on my own. Daniel was a quiet man, mid-40s maybe, broad-shouldered, but moved like someone trained to hold babies and dying people without hurting either. He wore soft sneakers that made no sound on the floor. The first time he came, he took off his shoes at the door. That's how I remember him. Not as the man who helped my husband, but as the stranger who treated my home like a sacred space. At first I kept my distance. I made tea, cleaned out drawers that didn't need cleaning, watched them from the kitchen the way a mother might watch a new babysitter. But slowly, something changed. Not with him, with me. He would speak to Arthur with a tenderness I hadn't seen in years. He'd say things like, "Good morning, Mr. Lewis, may I help you sit up?" As if Arthur could still understand. He never rushed, never frowned. And when Arthur refused to eat or muttered nonsense, Daniel would smile and say, "That's all right, we'll try again later." And in between those moments, he started noticing me. He'd ask if I'd eaten, if I needed help carrying laundry. Once he brought me a fresh rosemary plant from his garden because I'd mentioned in passing that I missed cooking with it. I remember standing in the kitchen with that little pot of rosemary, crying so softly I couldn't hear myself. It wasn't the plant. It was being seen. Really seen. I hadn't felt that in over a decade, and that's when I began to carry the secret. I never touched him. Never betrayed Arthur with anything more than a held glance too long or a hand that lingered on mine when passing a glass. But my heart betrayed before my body ever could. I knew it. He knew it. And we never said a word. It's been 5 years since then. Arthur passed, quietly, with me holding one hand and Daniel holding the other. Daniel left before the funeral. I haven't seen him since, but his presence stayed, in the memory of his voice, in the rosemary plant I still water every Tuesday, in the truth I've carried like a stone in my pocket, always there, always heavy. I'm telling you this not to confess. I'm telling you because someone out there might be living with a secret too, a love that came at the wrong time, wrapped in the right tenderness. You are not alone. People always ask me how long I was married, but no one ever asked how long I was happy. It's a strange thing to look back on a lifetime and realize most of it was spent being what others needed you to be, wife, mother, daughter, nurse, and never quite who you were beneath it all. I was 19 when Arthur and I married. In those days, that wasn't considered young, it was expected. My mother ironed my dress the night before with hands that had done the same for 2 daughters before me. She called it the right next step. I called it love, and in many ways it was. Arthur was steady, dependable, the kind of man who made you feel safe just by standing in a room. He built things with his hands, chairs, cabinets, once a crib that never creaked. He didn't talk much, but when he did, it was always certain. People respected him for that. I did too, but I was softer. I wrote poetry in margins of recipe books. I cried at sad commercials. I always wanted more than I said out loud. Still, I loved him. I truly did. He was my beginning, and for many years I believed he would be my only story. The first few years were sweet in that ordinary way most people forget to treasure. We had simple dinners, made love with the awkwardness of youth and the forgiveness of it too. We danced in the living room once, barefoot, while the radio played an old Ella Fitzgerald tune. I remember thinking, if this is all I ever have, it's enough. Then life began to layer over us. Children came, first James, then Rachel. Money was tight, but Arthur took every overtime shift he could get. I taught piano to the neighborhood kids from our front room. I never charged much. Some parents paid in eggs, some in vegetables from their gardens. I didn't mind. It felt like community. But somewhere along the way, the laughter faded, not all at once, just gradually. We stopped kissing hello, stopped dancing, stopped asking each other questions that didn't begin with, "Did you remember to?" or "Can you pick up?" Arthur became a man of habits. He liked his routines, his news at 6 p.m., his coffee black. He never raised his voice, not even when Rachel dropped his tools in the rain or James crashed his bike into the fence. But he also never raised much interest in anything outside of work and duty, and I disappeared slowly, like steam off a kettle, still warm, still moving, but eventually invisible. I never blamed him. Life isn't a fairy tale, and marriage is work. That's what everyone said. So I worked, I cooked, cleaned, showed up at every school recital. I laughed at his jokes even when they stopped being funny. I kept things running, but the years made me quieter, not sad, just hollow in places. I remember once, around our 30th anniversary, I sat at the kitchen table alone while he napped in the recliner. I'd made him a cake. No party, just us. And as I lit the candles, I caught sight of myself in the microwave door. Not a mirror, but enough reflection to stop me. My face looked tired, not old, just used, like a book someone had read too many times without really seeing the pages. That was the first time I wondered what my life might have been if I had waited just a little longer before marrying. If I had gone to art school like I wanted, if I had traveled, if I had been more than just his person. But the thought passed. It always did. Because what choice did I have? I don't want you to misunderstand. Arthur wasn't cruel. He wasn't violent. He never once made me feel unsafe. He just didn't see me. Not really. And when the dementia started, that became literal. He'd stare right at me and ask where his wife had gone. Once he called me Mary, his sister's name. Another time he asked the nurse if I was paid to live with him. I laughed it off because what else could I do? But something inside me broke that day, not out of anger, but grief. The man I had poured my entire self into no longer remembered the shape of my name on his tongue. Still, I stayed. That's what good wives do, isn't it? They stay. But I carried this ache, not just for the man I lost, but for the woman I had never been allowed to become. So when Daniel came and looked at me the way no one had in decades, when he asked questions that had nothing to do with medications or laundry or bills, when he asked, "Do you still play piano?" and then sat beside me on the bench as I stumbled through an old waltz with shaking hands and teary eyes, a part of me, the part I had buried in casseroles and calendars, stirred again. It terrified me. But even more than that, it reminded me I was still alive. I had been a wife for so long, I forgot I was also a woman, and a woman still wants to be seen, even if it's too late to be loved. There isn't a single moment when it happens, when the man you married begins to slip away. It's not like in the movies where someone forgets your name and everything unravels at once. No, in real life it's slower, quieter, crueler in its silence. It starts with small things. The first time Arthur forgot the name of our neighbor's dog, then he forgot where he left his wallet, not once, but 3 times in a week. I remember finding it in the freezer and laughing, trying to make light of it. "Well, at least your cash is cool," I said. He laughed too, but there was a flicker of fear in his eyes that I pretended not to see. The truth was already knocking. I just wasn't ready to let it in. Over the next year, the signs piled up. Forgotten appointments, burned toast, a near disaster when he left the stove on after boiling an egg and went to take a nap. Our son James suggested we see a doctor. Arthur refused. He was a proud man, always had been, the kind who fixed things with his hands, who built the shed in our backyard without asking for help. He didn't want to admit that something inside him was breaking, something no hammer or screwdriver could fix. Eventually, I made the appointment without telling him what it was really for, said it was just a checkup. The neurologist asked questions, ran tests. Arthur grew frustrated, then quiet. 3 weeks later, we had a diagnosis, vascular dementia, likely to progress. No cure. The doctor used careful, clinical words. I heard only one thing: he's going away, and I can't stop it. We walked to the car in silence. Arthur didn't look at me. He stared straight ahead, his jaw tight. When we got home, he went into the garage and stayed there until after dark. I sat in the kitchen, the lights off, the air still. I didn't cry, not that night. The tears came days later, when I caught him staring at a photo of our daughter on the mantel. "Who's this again?" he asked, pointing to his own little girl. I broke, but I didn't break in front of him. I waited until he went to bed and I sobbed into the laundry I was folding. That became my habit, crying while doing chores. Somehow it felt safer that way. As the disease progressed, pieces of Arthur slipped away. He stopped shaving, forgot how to button his shirts. He'd ask the same question 3 or 4 times in 10 minutes. Sometimes he'd become angry, even frightened if I corrected him. So I stopped correcting. I just smiled, nodded, and answered again like it was the first time. I began to lose more than just my husband. I lost time. I lost rest. I lost the version of myself that once woke up in the morning with something to look forward to. Everything became a cycle: medications, meals, diapers, doctor appointments. There was no music, no conversation, only repetition, only responsibility. I remember one morning, sitting at the table with a piece of toast in my hand, staring at the crumbs on the plate. Arthur was in the next room, humming to himself, rocking slightly in his chair. I realized I hadn't spoken to another adult in 4 days. I thought about calling Rachel, but what would I say? That I missed being asked how I was? That sometimes I went to the store just to hear another voice? No, that would make them worry. And worrying would make them visit, and visiting would make them feel guilty. So I stayed silent. The hardest part, I think, was when he forgot me. It happened slowly. First he stopped calling me by name. Then he started looking confused when I brought him food. Once he asked where his wife was. I told him I was right here. He stared at me like I was lying. It was like being erased in real time. And yet, every morning I still made his tea, still sat by his bed, still held his hand when the shaking got bad, because even if he didn't remember me, I remembered him. The man who built our daughter's crib, The man who worked overtime so we could send James to college. The man who once danced with me barefoot to Ella Fitzgerald. That man was gone, but I stayed because love doesn't vanish when memory does. It just changes shape. Still, I was disappearing too. No one asked how I was sleeping. No one noticed that I hadn't played the piano in 2 years. No one saw that I had stopped looking in mirrors. And then Daniel arrived. But that's another chapter. This one belongs to the slow grief of losing someone while they're still breathing, to the long nights, the quiet mornings, the shrinking days, and the ache of being alone, even with someone in the room. There is a kind of loneliness that people understand, the loneliness of an empty house, of silence after death, of a chair that's no longer pulled out for dinner. But then there is another kind, a deeper, quieter ache, the kind that comes when the house is full, but you are invisible. That was the loneliness I lived with. Every day, I moved through the house like a shadow, wiping counters, organizing pills, adjusting blankets. I was there in every room, every routine, but no one really saw me, not even the man I had given my life to, especially not him. Arthur sat most days in the old armchair by the window. His hands trembled, his eyes drifted. Sometimes he muttered old song lyrics under his breath. Sometimes he asked for people who were long gone. One day he asked if his mother was coming to visit. She'd been dead for 37 years. I nodded. Maybe tomorrow, I whispered, and kissed his forehead. What else could I say? I didn't tell the children. I didn't want them to pity him or me. Besides, they had their lives. James had a demanding job in the city. Rachel had 2 teenagers and a husband who traveled. They called, they visited when they could, but the heaviness of this house, of this life, wasn't something they could carry. I didn't expect them to. Still, I hoped sometimes that someone would ask, "Are you all right, Mom?" Not in passing, not as a formality, but really ask, and wait for the answer. No one did, and I wouldn't have known what to say if they had. I began talking to myself while doing chores. Not aloud, just in my head. I'd narrate the laundry folding, the meal prep, the sorting of medical bills. It was a way to feel like I still had a voice, like someone was listening. I stopped playing piano altogether. My fingers still knew the keys, but my heart didn't recognize the music anymore. What was the point of playing when no one heard? Even sleep stopped being restful. I'd wake every few hours to check if Arthur was still breathing. I slept light, like a soldier in a foxhole, ears tuned to every sigh, every shift. Sometimes I'd walk into the bathroom and lock the door just to sit alone, not to cry, just to exist as a woman for 5 minutes without being anyone's caretaker. People talk about burnout in nurses. No one talks about it in wives. No one prepares you for the isolation of devotion. And in that void, strange things happen. You begin to crave, not passion, not sex, not even romance, just recognition, just a voice saying, "You look tired, sit down, let me help." Just a pair of eyes that look at you, not through you, and that was the crack through which Daniel eventually slipped in. But before I let you meet him, you have to understand where I was. I was lonely, yes, but more than that, I was disappearing, and I didn't know how to ask to be found. It was a Tuesday. Not that the day matters, but I remember because the sheets were freshly changed and the house smelled faintly of lemon cleaner. I always cleaned before someone new came over. Even then, even with everything falling apart, I still wanted to present some version of control. The agency had called 2 days before. "We're sending someone new," they said. "Someone experienced, background checked, kind." That last word stuck with me, kind, as if that were a rare qualification. I hung up and didn't expect much. These men came and went. They were efficient, polite, distant. But when I opened the door that morning, I remember pausing, not because he was especially handsome or young or different, but because he took off his shoes. He stepped into my home like it was sacred, quiet, careful, intentional. "Mrs. Lewis?" he asked. "Yes," I replied. "Margaret is fine." He smiled gently, almost shyly. "I'm Daniel. I'll be helping with your husband." His voice was low but warm, steady, like someone who'd been around suffering long enough to respect its silence. Arthur was in the recliner, dozing. The morning sun was casting long stripes across the living room carpet. Daniel didn't speak right away. He just looked at him for a moment, not studying, not judging, just seeing. Then he crouched beside the chair and said softly, "Good morning, Mr. Lewis. I'm Daniel. I'll be with you for a little while. Let's be friends, all right?" Arthur didn't respond. He rarely did anymore. Daniel didn't seem bothered. He moved slowly, gently adjusting the pillow behind Arthur's neck. His hands were confident, tender. He didn't flinch when Arthur made a sudden jerk. He just steadied him like a tree against wind. I stood behind them, watching, unsure what to say. For once, I wasn't the one guiding the care. I didn't have to explain every routine. He didn't treat me like a checklist. Instead, after settling Arthur, he turned to me and asked, "Have you had breakfast?" I blinked. "I'm fine." He didn't push, just nodded, as if he understood what fine really meant. That first day, he stayed 5 hours. In that time, I learned very little about him. Just that he'd been doing this kind of work for over a decade, that he used to volunteer in hospices before going full-time, and that he liked rosemary in his tea. Not mint, rosemary. That small, strange detail stuck with me. A man who preferred something earthy, old-fashioned, unpretentious. It made sense. As the days passed, I began to notice things. Daniel never rushed, never raised his voice, never made Arthur feel like a burden. He sang softly sometimes while helping with baths. Not lyrics, just hums, low, calming tones that seemed to ground the room. And he never treated Arthur like a patient. He treated him like a man who was still there, even if buried beneath layers of broken memory. That kind of respect, it's rare, especially for the elderly. Especially for men like Arthur who could no longer speak for themselves. But what truly unnerved me, what truly began to shake something loose inside me, was the way Daniel looked at me. Not often, not intrusively, but directly, like I mattered in the story too. He'd ask if I was sleeping, if I needed anything picked up. Once he noticed I had a limp in my step and asked gently, "Are your knees giving you trouble today?" I hadn't told anyone about the arthritis, not even the kids, but he saw it. He saw me. That evening, after he left, I stood in the kitchen holding a mug of tea I hadn't touched. I stared at the back door, the sound of his voice still in my ears, and I felt something dangerous. Not desire, not yet, just the ache of being noticed, of mattering. I went to the piano after that, sat on the bench and lifted the lid. My fingers hovered above the keys. I didn't play, I couldn't, but I touched them. And in that moment, I realized something. It had been years since I was anything other than Arthur's wife. And Daniel, this stranger, had reminded me that I was still a person underneath all the caregiving. That was the first day, the first crack in the wall I'd built around my heart. I didn't know then what would come of it, but I felt it, like the softest knock on a locked door. It didn't happen quickly. That's the part most people don't understand. It wasn't some whirlwind, breathless attraction. There were no lingering stares across candlelight, no brushing hands under moonlight. That kind of thing belongs to people with time, with permission. This, what grew between me and Daniel, was different. It was slow, gentle, like sunlight finding its way through old curtains. He never overstepped, not once. In fact, I don't think he even knew, at first, that I was changing, that something inside me had begun to thaw after years of quiet frost. But he saw me, in the ways that matter most. He saw me when I forgot to eat because Arthur had been agitated all morning and I'd burned the toast. He noticed and brought me a sandwich, unwrapped, already cut diagonally. "You looked hungry," he said simply. I ate it without saying a word. I didn't even realize I was crying until a tear fell on the crust. He saw me when I winced going up the stairs. I had never mentioned my joints, never complained, but he began leaving Arthur's medication tray on the lower shelf. I always noticed. Once he came in carrying a small pot of rosemary. I grow it at home, he said, placing it on the windowsill by the sink. Smells like something sacred when the sun hits it. I nodded. I didn't trust my voice just then. Later, when he had gone and the house was quiet again, I stood by that window for 20 minutes just smelling that rosemary. I pressed a leaf between my fingers and felt more alive than I had in months, because it wasn't the herb, it was the gesture. It was being remembered, noticed, considered. I had spent years as the invisible weight that held everything together. The nurse, the scheduler, the cook, the cleaner. I was the body that moved so others didn't fall, and in that function I had vanished. But Daniel looked past the function. He asked questions no one else did. Do you still play music? What's your favorite season? Did you grow up in this town? Tiny things. But they awakened parts of me I thought had withered. I began brushing my hair again, not just for neatness, but with intention. I started wearing earrings some days, simple pearl studs I hadn't touched in years, not for anyone else, just for me. One afternoon I caught myself humming while folding laundry. It startled me. I couldn't remember the last time I'd made a sound for my own joy. It's important that I say this. I didn't fall in love with Daniel the way I fell in love with Arthur. Arthur had been bold, certain. He swept in and filled the room. Daniel was the opposite. He slipped in like warmth, like something you don't notice until the cold leaves your bones. And it was never physical. Not once did he cross a line. But the truth is, it didn't have to be physical for it to feel real. When someone sees you, truly sees you, after years of being background noise, something in you rises up in response. It's not about age. It's about being remembered while you're still alive. And I remember one moment more than any other. Arthur had had a difficult day, confused, angry, refusing to eat. I was exhausted. I sat on the back porch after Daniel got him to sleep. I didn't even hear him come outside. He handed me a cup of tea, sat on the steps, not beside me but nearby, enough to share the silence. Then he said, "You're carrying so much, and you do it so quietly." I didn't answer. I just nodded, my throat tight. "I see you, Margaret," he said softly, "even when no one else does." And in that moment, I broke. Not loudly, just a single tear down my cheek and a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding for years. I looked at him, and for the first time in a very long time, I felt known. There's a bitter taste that lives at the back of your tongue when you're carrying something you can't name out loud. It lingers like old coffee, like something half swallowed and never digested. That's what guilt felt like for me. I told myself it was nothing, that I hadn't done anything. I was still faithful, still dutiful, still waking up every morning and changing Arthur's bed sheets, laying out his clothes, warming his tea, massaging his hands when the stiffness became too much. I was still the same wife I'd always been. Except I wasn't. Because somewhere in the quiet hours between the medicine doses and the silence of evening, I had begun to feel again. And it wasn't for the man I'd married. I hated myself for it. I remember one morning in particular. Daniel had just left, and I went to put the dishes away. I reached for a glass, and as my fingers touched it, I suddenly felt this overwhelming wave of shame, so strong I nearly dropped it. I had to sit down on the floor, right there, by the sink, knees folded, chest tight. How could I, after everything Arthur had given me, allow this? A part of me wanted to confess, not to Arthur, he wouldn't have understood, but to someone, anyone. I even considered calling my sister Evelyn, but what would I say? I'm in love with a man who brings rosemary and wipes my husband's mouth with gentleness. I kept silent, I always had. But the silence grew heavy. I started avoiding mirrors. I didn't want to see the woman I was becoming, someone who smiled when Daniel walked in, who sometimes put on a little lipstick before his shift started, just in case. A woman who caught herself checking the clock, not because Arthur needed medicine, but because Daniel would arrive soon. The guilt crept into everything, into meals I couldn't finish, into music I couldn't play, into sleep I couldn't hold on to. And yet, even in the heaviness of guilt, there was lightness too, the lightness of being seen, of laughing at something silly he said about the neighbor's overgrown bushes, of talking about books and childhood summers and piano keys that stick in the winter. I began keeping a journal again. I hadn't written in years. At first it was just practical notes, which pills Arthur had taken, how much he ate, if he slept. But then the entries changed. Daniel brought chamomile tea today, said it helps him sleep. Arthur didn't recognize the hallway, but Daniel got him to calm down by singing that lullaby again. I caught myself humming. I think I'm in trouble. That last one, I wrote in the smallest handwriting, as if the page might judge me. Every time I closed the book, I tucked it beneath the dish towels. I was terrified of being found out, not by my children, or Arthur, or even Daniel, but by myself, by the woman inside me who had dared to want something again. Because what do you do with longing when it's directed at the wrong person? What do you do with the hunger to be seen when you're supposed to be invisible? There was no place for these feelings in the world I lived in. Caregivers don't fall in love. Wives of dying men don't feel desire. Women my age don't get new beginnings. We endure, we carry, we fold and tuck and swallow our wants like too hot tea. But the truth is, I did want. And no matter how I tried to deny it, my heart had already crossed the line my hands never would. That's the cruelty of it all. Love isn't always a choice, but silence is. So I stayed silent. I smiled when he arrived, I waved when he left, and I never let the word love come anywhere near my lips. But it lived there, bitter and warm, like something I couldn't stop tasting. It was a Sunday afternoon when Rachel came by. She always came on Sundays, usually with a casserole or a bag of groceries I hadn't asked for. She was a good daughter, organized, responsible, always a little rushed. She hugged me with one arm, kissed her father on the forehead like a nurse clocking in, and then wiped down my counters even though they were already clean. This time, something was different. She stood in the kitchen longer than usual, arms folded, eyes narrowed slightly at the rosemary plant on the windowsill. "He's here a lot," she said, not looking at me. I knew who she meant. Daniel. "Yes," I replied carefully. "He takes the evening shifts now, too. It's helped a lot." She nodded slowly, but her mouth tightened. "Don't you think it's a little much?" I froze. There was no question in her tone. It was already an accusation, wrapped in concern, softened by habit, but sharp all the same. "He's just very kind," I said, trying to keep my voice even. "And your father responds well to him." Rachel looked at me then, really looked, and I saw it. Suspicion, confusion, maybe even disappointment. "Mom," she said quietly, "is there anything you want to tell me?" That moment, that single sentence, cracked something in me. Not because she suspected, but because I suddenly wanted to tell her everything. I wanted to say, "I haven't been touched in years. I haven't heard someone say my name with care since before your children were born. I've been invisible so long I forget what it feels like to be a person." But I didn't. Instead, I said what I always said. "There's nothing going on." She didn't believe me. I saw it in her face. There was a pause. Then she sighed, opened the fridge, and changed the subject. But something had shifted. That night, I stood in front of the mirror brushing my teeth and saw the woman she saw, not the tired caregiver or faithful wife, but the woman who had, perhaps, allowed something to blossom where nothing should have. The guilt came flooding back, not because I had betrayed my husband, but because I had been caught feeling again, caught wanting. I began to shrink after that, wore quieter clothes, spoke less, pulled back. Daniel noticed. "Are you all right?" he asked one morning, kneeling to help Arthur with his slippers. "Of course," I lied. He didn't press. He never did. But he looked at me a little longer that day, as if he knew something had been broken and was waiting to see if I would try to put it back together. Rachel stopped coming as often after that. I think she wanted to believe I'd corrected something in myself, that whatever it was, it had passed. But it hadn't. It had only gone deeper underground. I didn't stop loving Daniel. I just stopped allowing myself to feel it in the open, and that perhaps was worse. Because now I was not just lonely, I was ashamed of the small comfort that had kept me alive, the kind smile, the remembered tea, the shared silence on the porch. I began to wonder, is it more immoral to feel something forbidden, or to deny yourself any joy at all? I didn't have an answer. I only had Rachel's eyes in my mind, and the weight of a love I carried like a stolen object, hidden, precious, and never mine to keep. I remember the sound before anything else. Arthur had fallen. A heavy, dull thud, like a sack of wet clothes hitting the floor. Then the silence that followed, which was somehow louder. I was in the kitchen drying a pan. I dropped it without thinking and ran. He was on the living room floor, crumpled on his side, his hand trembling against the hardwood. His eyes were wide and wet with panic. He couldn't speak, not anymore, but the terror in his face was unmistakable. "Arthur," I said, kneeling, trying to lift him. "It's all right, love. I've got you." But I didn't. My arms couldn't hold his weight. My knees burned against the floor. I was shaking, breathless, useless. And then Daniel was there. He must have just arrived for his shift. He didn't speak, didn't ask what happened. He assessed, gently but quickly, then scooped Arthur into his arms with practiced grace and placed him back into the chair. I watched as he checked for bruises, for swelling, for broken skin. His hands moved steadily, kind, capable. My own hands were still trembling in my lap. "It's okay now," Daniel said, his voice low and grounding. But I wasn't okay. I had been doing this alone for so long, holding the weight of a man, a marriage, a life slipping away. And in that moment, I realized something terrifying. I couldn't do it anymore. Not by myself, not in silence. Daniel turned to me. "Sit down, Margaret. Please." I obeyed. Not out of weakness, but because I couldn't hold the weight of pretending for one more second. And then it happened. He reached out. And he held my hand. Not a casual touch, not a passing gesture. He held it, like someone anchoring a person mid-storm, like someone saying, "I'm here. I see what this is doing to you." I didn't cry right away. I just sat there, feeling the warmth of his skin on mine, a warmth I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't romantic, not really. It was something deeper, quieter, like someone placing their palm over a wound and saying without words, "You're not alone." Eventually, I looked at him, and he looked at me, and everything we had not said, everything we had carefully avoided for weeks, rose to the surface like mist. Still, no words, just breath, just understanding, just the unbearable weight of emotion between two people who had never crossed a line but had long since stepped into something sacred. Then I did something I'm not proud of. I didn't let go, not right away. I held his hand as if it were the only thing keeping me upright, as if that one point of contact could keep me from unraveling. And maybe it did. When I finally pulled away, I didn't apologize. I just whispered, "Thank you." Daniel nodded, and then he went back to folding laundry, as if the moment had never happened. But it had. I felt it in my chest all night, like a pulse I hadn't noticed before. I lay in bed beside Arthur, listening to his shallow breath, my own heart thudding with something I didn't know how to name. Grief, guilt, love, all of it maybe, or something else entirely. The strange, unbearable truth of being human, of holding too much in one heart. That was the day he held my hand, and even now I can still feel it, not the warmth of it, but the meaning, and how for one brief moment someone carried me. It was a Tuesday again. Funny how the worst days of your life don't come with thunder or warning. They come wrapped in sunlight, folded into the rhythm of ordinary things. I'd just finished helping Arthur with breakfast. Daniel had stepped out to take a call. The house was still, too still. Arthur was staring out the window, not fidgeting, not mumbling, just still. There was something strange about his eyes, For months now, they had been clouded, distant, as if he was watching the world from somewhere far behind glass. But that morning, they were clear. He turned to me, really turned, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I saw recognition. "Maggie," he said. My knees nearly buckled. No one had called me that in years. "Maggie," he said again, softer this time, almost like he was remembering a dream. "You were wearing that blue dress, the one with the little flowers, at the train station. You cried so much." I dropped into the chair across from him, hands pressed to my mouth. He was talking about the day he left for basic training. I was 18. He was 20. I cried so hard I hiccuped. I had forgotten the dress was blue. He hadn't. His voice was clear but fragile, like porcelain. "I wanted to marry you that day," he said, his eyes still on me, "but I thought I needed to earn it first." I didn't breathe. And then he looked at me, really looked, and said something I will carry to my grave. "You've stayed with me so long, even after I left." My eyes filled instantly. "I never thanked you," he whispered. "I should have. You were always more than I deserved." I reached for his hand, but he looked away, as if something was already slipping again, the fog returning. Still, I held on. "Arthur," I whispered, "I'm right here." His gaze drifted, his lips parted slightly, and just like that, he was gone again, back behind the glass. I sat there in silence, my hands shaking, my throat thick. He remembered, even if only for a moment, and in that moment he saw me, not just as the woman who folded his clothes and managed his medication, but as his wife, the girl at the train station, the love he once chose. It broke me, because it reminded me of everything we had lost, not just the man he had been, but the woman I had become in his absence. And worse, it reminded me that the man I was beginning to love now had never known me as her. Daniel knew the tired version, the woman who wore elastic waists and sensible shoes, who cried over tea bags and slept on the edge of her own bed. He had never known the girl in the blue dress, but Arthur had, and even in the shadow of dementia, he reached for her, remembered her, loved her. That memory became both a gift and a burden, because it was the last time he ever said my name. The next morning, he didn't recognize the house. By the end of the week, he didn't recognize himself. And I couldn't look at Daniel the same way, because for all the tenderness he had shown me, for all the care and kindness, he wasn't the one who stood at the train station that day. He wasn't the man who held my hand under the table during our first dinner with my parents. He hadn't built my world with me. Arthur had. And no matter how far he drifted, some part of him still loved me. That broke me, because it meant the love I thought I'd lost was still there, right before it disappeared forever. It rained the day after Arthur forgot how to walk. Not suddenly, his legs had been weak for months, but that morning, they simply stopped obeying, like his body had decided it no longer wanted the burden of being carried. Daniel helped me lift him into the bed. We worked in silence, in sync, like we had done so many times before. But something had shifted, and we both felt it. I could see it in Daniel's face. He knew this wasn't just another decline. It was the beginning of the end. Later, after Arthur had finally drifted into sleep, Daniel asked if we could sit on the porch. I hesitated, but the air inside the house felt too heavy, too filled with breath that wasn't mine. We sat with mugs of tea, steam curling between us. The sky hung low, gray and soft. Rain tapped gently on the roof. It smelled of damp leaves, old wood, and something else I couldn't name, something like goodbye. Daniel didn't speak for a long time. He just sat there, his hands wrapped around the mug like he was holding something fragile. Then finally, he said it. "I think I need to step back." My breath caught. "Why?" I asked. I didn't mean it to sound so desperate, but it came out sharp, too fast, too raw. He looked at me, and for the first time, he didn't smile. "Because I'm starting to feel things I shouldn't." The air between us shifted. He didn't need to explain. I knew. We both knew. I haven't done anything, he said softly. I wouldn't, I couldn't. But every time I walk through that door, I want to ask how you are before I ask about him. And that's not right. I looked down at my hands. They were clasped too tightly, my knuckles white. I'm his wife, I whispered. He nodded. I know. That's why I need to go. We sat there a long time, saying nothing, letting the weight of everything unsaid settle over us like the rain. And then finally I spoke. Do you think in another life? He interrupted me gently. Don't, please. Because we both knew the truth. There wasn't another life, just this one, just this impossible moment between what was right and what was real. A love that bloomed too late, too quietly, and in a place where it could never stay. He reached out then, almost instinctively, and placed his hand over mine on the bench. His touch was light, respectful, but filled with a tenderness that undid me. I care for you, Margaret, he said, deeply, but you're still walking through this, and I can't be the person who makes it harder. I wanted to scream, not from anger, but from the grief of having something so gentle, so good, show up in your life at the wrong time. Instead, I just nodded, and then, before I could stop myself, I asked the one question I had no right to ask. Would you have loved me if things were different? His eyes met mine, and in that quiet porch light, he gave me the only answer I would ever get. I already do. He didn't say it was his last day. There was no dramatic farewell, no suitcase at the door, no long hug in the hallway. Daniel just didn't come back. I knew it before the agency called. They left a message on the machine. Daniel has transferred to another client per request. We'll send someone new by Friday. Their voices were always cheerful, practiced, sterile. I didn't return the call. I sat at the kitchen table and stared at the empty chair across from me, the one he always took his tea in. I reached for the rosemary plant on the sill and pinched a leaf between my fingers. It no longer smelled like warmth. It smelled like absence. Arthur didn't notice the change. He hadn't spoken a full sentence in days. His body had become still, heavy with surrender. His eyes wandered, glassy, seeing things I couldn't. Sometimes he called for people who weren't there. Once he looked at me and asked if I was the nice nurse. I said yes, because it was easier than explaining who I had once been. The new caregiver arrived a few days later, a young woman named Carla. She was competent, efficient. She smiled a lot and filled the silence with small talk. But she didn't know how Arthur liked the music low in the evenings. She didn't know to warm the towel before wiping his hands. She didn't look at me like I was someone still here. I smiled politely. I folded sheets. I made tea for one. Then, a week later, I found the envelope. It was tucked under the rosemary pot, sealed, plain. No name on the outside, but I knew. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside was a single note written in that neat, slanted script I'd come to know better than I realized. I don't know how to say goodbye without making it worse, so I'll just say thank you for letting me see you, for letting me care, and for being the quietest, strongest person I've ever known. I'll carry that with me, always, D. No promises, no confessions, just truth. I held that letter to my chest and sat in the dim morning light until the shadows stretched long across the floor. I didn't cry. Not then. The tears came that night after Arthur fell asleep. I went to the piano, lifted the cover, and pressed one key. Just one. The sound was soft, unsure, like something waking up after too long in silence. I didn't play more. I just let the sound ring out. Then I placed the letter gently inside the piano bench, closed the lid, and whispered a goodbye I never got to say. It was better this way. No final moment, no cruel ending, just a space that would never be filled again, and a rosemary plant on my windowsill that would forever remind me. Sometimes the greatest love stories are the ones never lived out loud. Arthur died on a Wednesday. It was early, barely past dawn. The sky outside the bedroom window was just beginning to warm with color. A pale peach light seeped through the curtains, casting long shadows across the floor. I was holding his hand, as I had for so many nights, though by then his fingers were thin and cold and still. He didn't struggle, he didn't speak, he simply stopped. One breath, and then none. It was quiet, so terribly quiet. I had imagined, foolishly, that when the moment came, I would feel something, relief, sorrow, a final pang of love, but all I felt was stillness, like the air had forgotten how to move. I didn't cry, not at first. I closed his eyes, pulled the blanket up to his chest, sat there in the chair beside him for almost an hour, listening to the ticking of the wall clock. I hadn't realized how loud it was. It was the only sound in the room. Eventually, I called the hospice nurse, then the children. James cried. Rachel didn't. She just asked about the funeral, said she'd take care of the arrangements. I nodded through the phone, though she couldn't see me. I agreed to the chapel she suggested, the music, the flowers. I agreed to all of it, because I had no energy left to fight for anything. That night, I sat in the now too quiet living room and poured myself a glass of wine I didn't finish. I stared at the empty recliner, the spot on the floor where the sunlight used to hit his feet in the afternoon. The silence was no longer heavy. It was total. I thought I would feel free. Isn't that awful to say? I thought there would be space now, for rest, for rediscovery, maybe even for healing. But instead, there was only the echo of everything that had passed. The caregiving, the nights of worry, the endless meals he no longer tasted. All of it had become muscle memory, and my body didn't know how to stop. I found myself waking up at 3 a.m. to check if he was breathing, even though there was no longer anyone lying beside me. I still poured 2 cups of tea. I still laid out his socks. Grief is not loud. It is habit breaking against the wall of absence. I didn't call Daniel. I didn't even know how. He hadn't left a number, just the letter. And maybe that was for the best, because the part of me that had loved him, the small soft part I had buried beneath duty and guilt, was mourning too, not for what was, but for what never had the chance to be. Sometimes in the middle of folding towels or boiling water, I'd wonder where he was, if he thought of me, if he still planted rosemary in the spring. I kept his letter inside the piano bench, not out of hope, but because some things deserve to be remembered, even if they were never real in the way people expect. After the funeral, people came and went. They brought flowers, casseroles, polite stories. They said I had been strong. They said Arthur was lucky to have me. No one asked if I missed being seen. No one asked if I was lonely before he was gone. I smiled. I nodded. I thanked them. Then I closed the door, took off my shoes, and sat alone in the stillness that had now become mine. I didn't feel like a widow. I felt like a woman standing in a life she didn't recognize. One chapter had ended, but the page ahead was still blank, and that blankness terrified me more than death, because now, for the first time in my life, there was nothing left telling me who I had to be, only the quiet question whispering in the corners of the house, and now, Margaret, who are you? It was almost 2 years after Arthur's death when I saw him again. By then, the house had settled into its new rhythm, quiet, slow, almost hollow. I'd rearranged the furniture, not because I needed to, but because I couldn't stand looking at the recliner in the same place every morning. The rosemary plant had grown wild in its small pot, stretching toward the light like something determined to keep living. The letter was still inside the piano bench. I never read it again. I didn't need to, but I never moved it either. Then one afternoon I saw his name, Daniel. It was on a flyer at the library, a caregiving seminar. Guest speaker, Daniel R. End of life care with dignity. My heart kicked, sharp and sudden. I hadn't felt anything that alive in months. I told myself I wouldn't go. Then I went. The seminar was small, held in a modest community room with bad lighting and lukewarm coffee. I sat in the back. I don't think he saw me at first. He was standing at the front, speaking softly, confidently, as always. He looked older, a little more gray at the temples, still quiet, still grounded, still him. He talked about care as presence, about bearing witness to people's lives as they faded. He said, "Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do for someone is to stay." That nearly undid me. After it ended, people lined up to speak with him. I waited, clutching my coat like armor. Then finally it was just us. He turned and stopped. For a moment, neither of us said a word. Then he smiled, not a big smile, a sad, warm one, like he was relieved I still existed. "Margaret," he said. I nodded. "Hi." We sat in a quiet corner of the lobby, two chairs, two paper cups of tea. It felt like no time had passed, and yet everything had changed. We didn't speak of Arthur. We didn't need to. We didn't speak of what we never had. Instead, we talked about the rosemary, about the piano I was finally playing again, about his new clients, about how tired we both were, tired in that way only caregivers and mourners truly understand. At one point, he looked at me and said, "I think about you. Not all the time, but when the light hits the porch just right, or when I hear someone hum to themselves, I remember." I felt tears sting my eyes, but I didn't let them fall. "I remember too," I said, and that was enough. There was no promise of more, no reaching for hands, no second chances, just recognition, just peace. A soft goodbye that came years late, but exactly when it needed to. We stood to leave. He opened the door for me, as he always had. And as I stepped outside, into the golden afternoon light, I heard him say behind me, "I'm glad I saw you again." I turned. "So am I." Then I walked away, not because I had to, but because it was time. I'm 71 years old, and there are fewer years ahead of me than behind. I don't say that with fear, just honesty. The kind that only comes after you've buried a husband, watered the same plant through every season, and learned how to live in silence without letting it harden you. Sometimes late at night, I sit by the window with a cup of tea and think about the people I've been: a wife, a mother, a caregiver, a ghost of myself, a woman briefly, wildly, quietly in love. I never told my children about Daniel. I don't think I ever will. It wouldn't serve them. They'd see betrayal where there was only survival. They'd try to measure it in right and wrong, and it was never that simple. Because here's the truth. One I've carried in the lining of my heart all these years. Love doesn't always come wrapped in permission. Sometimes it arrives softly, unexpectedly, through the cracks grief leaves behind, and if you're lucky or cursed, you'll feel it before your heart is ready. Daniel was never mine, I was never his, but for a brief, aching moment, he saw me, and I saw myself. That is what I carry now, not regret, not shame, but the memory of having been seen, fully, when I felt most invisible. Arthur is buried beneath a maple tree not far from here. I visit him on Sundays. I bring fresh flowers, sometimes play an old Ella Fitzgerald song on my phone while I sit. I think he would have liked that. He was a good man. We loved each other the best way we knew how, and when he could no longer remember me, I remembered for both of us, until the very end. But I've also learned that you can hold space for more than one truth, that grief and joy can share a table, that you can mourn the past and still feel grateful for the small sacred flickers that arrive unexpectedly, like rosemary in the kitchen light, like a hand gently holding yours after a fall, like a letter tucked beneath a plant you never threw away. What I know now is this: life doesn't always give us resolution, but it does sometimes offer peace. I live quietly now, simply. I read more. I've started playing piano again. I talk to myself less and sing out loud more, just a little. And sometimes when no one's around, I still check the porch, just once, to see if he's there. He never is. But I smile anyway, because some loves don't need to last forever. Some just need to arrive. And if they leave you softer, if they remind you you're still alive, then maybe that's enough. If you've ever carried a quiet love in your heart, one the world wouldn't understand, but it kept you warm when nothing else could, you're not alone. And maybe, just maybe, it was enough. Tell me in the comments, have you ever loved someone at the wrong time?